Every year, my family gathers in West Palm Beach for what should be a perfect tropical getaway. But one drunken night led my cousins and me into a dark Florida swamp, where we heard sounds so haunting I can still hear them when I close my eyes. Every year, my family goes on an epic vacation together, staying at my aunt and uncle's house located right on the ocean in West Palm Beach, Florida. Their son, Will, is the same age as me, and we have always been good friends. It isn't just my immediate family that attends. My other aunt and uncle join us as well, bringing their kids along. Among them is their daughter, Teresa, who is my best friend. Because Teresa and I are the same age, have the same last name, and share a physical resemblance, people often mistake us for twins. Throughout high school and into our adulthood, we actually enjoyed leaning into this, telling strangers on vacation that we were indeed twins. As we grew older, the dynamic of these vacations shifted from building sandcastles to partying. Teresa, Will, and I would spend our days relaxing on the beach with the rest of the family, but once the sun went down, Will would take us out to the local bars and clubs. Since he was the local boy, he knew all the hot spots and exactly where to go for a good time. On one specific vacation a few years ago, the three of us witnessed something so bizarre and unsettling that it continues to bother and freak me out to this day. While Teresa and Will tend to dismiss it as a prank or a weird occurrence, I am not so sure. On this particular night, the trip started like any other West Palm vacation. Will had a tendency to occasionally drink a bit too much, and Teresa and I knew his limits well. Usually, when he reached that point, we would call it a night and find a ride home. I always took on the role of the responsible one, limiting my own drinking to ensure that my cousins didn't end up in trouble or in a ditch somewhere. However, on this night, Will became exceptionally rowdy at a bar. He started mouthing off to people, claiming that as a local he could say whatever he wanted. His behavior eventually got him physically thrown out of the establishment by a bouncer. Will was mumbling and frustrated, but he wasn't injured. I told Teresa to keep an eye on him while I walked away to secure an Uber for us to get home. While waiting for the ride, I briefly called my boyfriend to check in and tell him about our chaotic night. Just as I hung up, Teresa ran over to me in a total panic. She admitted she had been distracted by her phone and hadn't been paying attention to Will, who had taken the opportunity to wander off into the night. We began frantically running through the streets, yelling his name, but Will wasn't answering his phone. After a few minutes of searching, Teresa spotted him walking in a crooked line toward a heavily wooded, muddy area. In Florida, I wasn't sure if you would call it a forest or a swamp, but for the sake of the story, a swamp feels more appropriate. Teresa managed to grab him before he entered the thick brush and started scolding him, but Will was just laughing like a toddler. Suddenly, he broke free from her grip and sprinted directly into the swamp. Driven by a mix of adrenaline and pure rage, Teresa and I sprinted into the woods after him. Because he was so intoxicated, he wasn't moving very fast, and it didn't take long for us to catch up to him. Using the flashlights on our cell phones, we could see just how gross and mud-covered the area was. Our feet were completely caked in filth. Just as we were about to drag him back out, Will suddenly told us to shush. He ducked down, looking genuinely terrified, a complete 180 from his behavior only seconds before. That was when we heard it, shouting and screaming coming from somewhere deep within the swamp. It wasn't normal screaming. It was a sound I had never heard before and hoped to never hear again. The screams echoed all around us, making it impossible to tell exactly where they were coming from, but it was clear that whoever was making those sounds was in serious trouble. Then, just as abruptly as the noise had started, everything went deathly silent. We stayed frozen in that muddy swamp for at least 15 minutes, too terrified to move, before finally sprinting back toward the safety of the city streets. The silence that followed those horrific, soul-shattering screams was almost worse than the noise itself. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to press against our eardrums, making every tiny rustle of the surrounding brush sound like a thunderclap. We stood absolutely frozen in the knee-deep, foul-smelling mud of the Florida swamp. Our cell phone flashlight beams were shaking uncontrollably in our hands as we aimed them toward the dense thicket where the sound had originated. Will, who had been completely incoherent, stumbling and drunkenly laughing just minutes before, was now deathly still. The sheer terror of the moment had acted like a cold bucket of water, bringing him to a state of absolute sobriety. His eyes were wide, reflecting the faint light of our phones, and his breathing was shallow. We waited in that darkness for what felt like an eternity, listening for any sign of movement, a footstep, a breath, or the rustle of a jacket, but the swamp had gone completely and unnervingly quiet. Eventually, the primal instinct to survive overrode the paralysis of our fear. Without a word, we turned and began to scramble back toward the direction of the city streets. The mud was thick and clay-like, suctioning onto our shoes and making every step a physical struggle. We didn't care about the filth or the ruined clothes. We only cared about getting away from the oppressive darkness of those trees. We tripped over submerged roots and pushed through jagged branches that scraped at our arms, driven by the singular goal of reaching the light. When we finally broke through the tree line and hit the solid, familiar texture of the concrete sidewalk, we didn't stop. We sprinted under the bright orange glow of the streetlights until we reached a well-lit gas station a few blocks away. Standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of the gas station, we were a sight to behold. We were three young people completely covered in black swamp muck from the waist down, gasping for air and trembling. The cashier looked at us with a mixture of confusion and concern, but we were too shaken to explain. I pulled out my phone with shaky fingers and summoned an Uber. When the car arrived, the driver took one look at our mud-caked legs and sighed in disgust, but after seeing the genuine terror on our faces, he laid down some old newspapers and agreed to take us back to my aunt's house. During the entire ride, the cabin was silent. No one checked their phones, and no one made a joke. We were all internally processing the raw, guttural nature of the screams we had just witnessed. I kept trying to rationalize it, telling myself it was perhaps a group of local kids playing a cruel prank or even a wounded animal, but deep in my gut, I knew better. That was a human sound, the sound of someone in the final moments of their life. The next morning, the Florida sun was out in full force, and the ocean looked like a shimmering turquoise dream from the balcony. It was the kind of morning that usually promised a perfect vacation day, but the atmosphere inside the house was thick with tension. As I walked into the kitchen, I found my aunt standing by the counter, her eyes glued to the small television mounted in the corner. The local news was on, and the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen made my blood run cold. There was a massive police presence cordoned off around the very area of the swamp we had entered the night before. The news anchor was reporting on a high-stakes manhunt for a dangerous individual who had escaped from a nearby detention facility earlier that evening. As the news report continued, they showed aerial footage of the woods. My stomach did a slow, nauseating flip as I recognized the specific clusters of trees and the muddy clearing where we had stood frozen in the dark. The police spokesperson stated that they had received multiple 911 calls from residents in the nearby neighborhood reporting distressing vocalizations and screams of agony coming from the brush between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, the exact window of time we were there. They revealed that investigators had discovered a disturbed scene within the swamp, including discarded clothing and evidence of a violent struggle. They were searching for a man with a history of extreme violence who was believed to be hiding in the dense vegetation. Hearing this, Will, who had been sitting at the kitchen table nursing a coffee, turned as white as a sheet. He dropped his head into his hands and finally admitted something he hadn't told us the night before. He confessed that right before he told us to shush and duck down. He hadn't just heard something. He thought he had seen a tall, dark figure standing perfectly still between two cypress trees, watching us. He hadn't said anything at the time because he was so intoxicated and was terrified that his mind was manifesting his worst fears. but seeing the news report confirmed his nightmare. We hadn't been alone in that mud. We were likely being watched by a predator while we were at our most vulnerable. The realization of how close we had come to a horrific fate cast a permanent shadow over the rest of the trip. If we had stayed in that bar 5 minutes longer, or if we had chased Will just 50 feet deeper into the swamp to catch him, we would have likely stumbled directly into a crime scene, or, worse, into the arms of the escaped convict. We had been standing in the dark, unarmed and distracted, while a man capable of unspeakable things was lurking just feet away in the shadows. The screams we heard weren't a prank. They were the reality of a tragedy that was unfolding while we stood by, paralyzed by the unknown. We spent the remaining days of the vacation in a daze, staying close to the house and avoiding the outdoors once the sun began to dip below the horizon. The vibrant, neon-lit streets of West Palm Beach, which used to represent fun and freedom, now felt like a thin veil covering a dark and dangerous underworld. Even now, years later, when my family gathers for our annual trip, the swamp incident is rarely spoken of, and when it is, it's discussed in hushed tones. Teresa and will try to maintain a sense of bravado, laughing it off as a crazy night. But I see the way they scan the tree lines whenever we drive past a wooded area. I still have recurring nightmares about the oppressive weight of that swamp silence and the sound of those screams echoing through the humid Florida air. It serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that no matter how beautiful the destination, there is always a darkness lurking just beyond the reach of the streetlights, waiting for someone to take a wrong turn into the woods.